So welcome, Mike Cook, from King's College London. It's a pleasure to have you here. So glad that you're back to talk about PCG, mass gardening, and very tasty oatmeal. So Mike Cook is the founder of the Procedural Generation Jam, and he's also the author of Angelina, who's an agent who makes her own games. So with that, welcome, Mike.
Thanks so much, Mirjam. It's lovely to be here. I think I gave this talk the last time, it was a couple of years ago now. Let me get it up here. There we go. And that should be full screen. So yeah, thank you so much for having me back. It's lovely to meet another class. I hope it's all going well at the start of term. My name is Mike. I work at King's College London. I've been there about a year now, where I'm a senior lecturer in AI. And I'm here to talk to you today about procedural generation, especially as part of kind of an artistic or creative practice. And we're going to talk about some of the ways I think about procedural generation, some of the ways I've used it in the past, yeah, hopefully have some time for questions afterwards, maybe. So I am a researcher for most of my day job. So I work in a field called automated game design, where we build AI systems that can design games on their own, or model the game design process. So think about how humans design games and then build systems that try and mimic that, and then use that to kind of learn more about game design. So as Mirjam just mentioned, I made a system called Angelina that designed games, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And I also work in computational creativity. So this is a field that's not just interested in the outputs, what an AI produces, but also kind of how we feel about those outputs, whether we believe that an AI system is creative or not, which has become a lot more important in the last few years. And I make games in my spare time, which feeds back into my research, and then that feeds back into my games, which is very cool, and I feel very lucky to do that. My email address is on the last slide, but if you want to talk to me about games or procedural generation anytime, feel free to get in touch. That's mike@possibilityspace.org. Okay. So I am here today to talk to you about procedural generation. Many of you probably have heard the term before, even if you've not used it, and maybe you've played games that feature procedural generation, like Minecraft. So Minecraft uses procedural generation to build its beautiful worlds, like the things that we're seeing here. And I've spent my whole career thinking about procedural generation, how we make procedural generators, how we use algorithms to make things that that we put into our games and other creative works. And I didn't mention this 2 years ago when I last gave the talk, but of course, lots of things have changed in that time. And today there's also this sense that some of you might be expecting to hear about generative AI today. So things like Midjourney or DALL-E. But I won't be talking about that really. And you'll see why that is kind of later on. There's a very specific thing that we're interested in today. So these systems have their own interests and problems and benefits and weaknesses. But today I want to kind of convince you to look into a different kind of generative system. We're going to look at how we can build systems that can make things in our games and how we can think about that as an artistic process in itself. So I'm seeing my camera glitching out a bit. I hope the connection's okay. If there is a problem, just let me know, but hopefully it's okay on your end as well. So as Mirjam said, I founded something called the Procedural Generation Jam almost 10 years ago now. And the slogan of this event was "Make something that makes something." So this was supposed to be an invitation to everyone to come and just have a go at procedural generation, have a go at making a system that makes something else. And it didn't matter kind of what that was or what technology you used or whether you used any technology at all. We were just interested in what it means to make a thing that makes things. And today I want to come and talk to you about this from a slightly different angle maybe to normal, which is to think about it like gardening. So this metaphor we're going to use throughout the whole talk, and we're going to think about what it means to make a procedural generator and look after it and nurture it and change it and let it grow wild sometimes as well. And the inspiration behind this metaphor came from a couple of places in particular. One is this amazing talk by Max Kraminski that they gave at the Roguelike Celebration in 2018. So this happens every year. It's an amazing event. It's actually happening next month. I'm going to be speaking at it for the first time. But in this talk, which you can find on YouTube, Max talks about gardening from the perspective of the player. So the idea that you're stuck in this one space that you are kind of looking after. So in Animal Crossing, for example, you get given an island, and that's the only thing you get in the game. You don't get to, go to another island and start again. You just have this one place that you look after. And I love this talk. It's a fantastic talk. But it also got me thinking about how when we build procedural generators, we're often doing the same thing. We're kind of tending to this system over time and making it into what we imagine it could be. And the other thing that really inspired me was Annals of the Peregrines, which is a piece of generated fiction written or created, I guess, by Emily Short, who's a very famous narrative designer and technologist. And Emily made this for the National Novel Generating Month. And it is a travel guide for a country that doesn't exist. So it's a fictional country, and it tells you about all of the places in this country. And it sounds a lot like kind of England. It's definitely inspired by like historical places in England. So this is a place called Heselchester, and it has poetic descriptions like sunlight filtered through rustling leaves. And it tells you about things like the history of the place, its traditions, who runs it, what currency they use, where else you can visit from here. And it uses these illustrations which aren't generated, they're actually from old public domain books. So this is a really amazing piece of work that you can find online for free. And it was entered as part of this competition to generate a 50,000 word novel, usually in a month. So what's really special about this piece? I think this is basically one of the best pieces of generated text in existence. I think it's an amazing project. One of the things that's special about it is just, it's a great thing to read through. It's really interesting. Emily uses lots of interesting techniques and data, but also she wrote an appendix where she explains her process for making this. And that appendix is one of the most interesting essays about procedural generation. And I've clipped out one bit for you. She says, I spent considerable time working on the machine, the procedural generator, and its various features before I produced anything I considered worth recording here. I would generate a few provinces worth of content, so the descriptions of a few towns, and then I would add that content to this file, and then I would read through it and add to the engine new content elements based on the inspirations of the text generated so far. So in this description of her creative process, Emily's talking about how the final version of this generator is not the only thing that matters. What matters was all of the steps that she went through on the way to produce this text. So there's this sense that there was periods where she was kind of looking after the generator, trimming things, planting new seeds, adding new content. And then she was sort of stepping back to kind of appreciate what was growing and think about what she would like to change next time. And just like with a garden, you don't know what's going to grow exactly. Even if you plant the same seeds every year, you never get exactly the same things out. But by making small changes, Emily could adjust the kinds of things that she was seeing coming out of the generator. So I really like this idea of this cycle that we go through when we build a generative system. And it's similar to building a game or any other kind of creative work, this cycle of feedback and changing. And I want to talk kind of about the two extreme types of garden in our metaphor, and to talk to you about the two different starting points for procedural generation kind of. So at one extreme, we have very, very strong control over the generator. So this is something like an ornamental garden, like the one that you can see here. So in this garden, every single flower, every leaf on a hedge, every line and building and construction, everything has been placed perfectly to give a very, very controlled view to whoever comes here. It's not completely controlled. They don't know exactly how many yellow flowers are going to appear or which day of the year they're going to bloom, but they know quite confidently what this garden will look like. And this is kind of, from a procedural generation perspective, we can think of like, there's actually an even more extreme version where it's like absolute control. There's no generation at all. So something like Super Mario, it's the same levels every time you play it. That's kind of the equivalent of artificial flowers in our gardening metaphor. But thinking about strong control, this is starting from a position where we have a lot of knowledge about what we want to produce, and we're going to very carefully sculpt this place so it produces exactly what we want. And you might find that this is something that you do when you make games. So if, for example, you're very experienced at designing levels, you might want to use that knowledge of level design to build your level generator. You might want to take that knowledge and experience you have and put it in an algorithm. And a really nice example of this is a guy called Derek Yu, who is an independent game designer, and he's been making games since he was a teenager. He made a lot of quite famous indie games. He was a big part of an indie game community, including Eternal Daughter and Aquaria. Aquaria was one of the early indie game hits of like the digital download era. And I still listen to the soundtrack. It's a great game. And then Derek went on to make Spelunky. And if you've not heard of Spelunky before, it's an action platformer with procedurally generated levels. And it's probably more than 50% of the reason anyone talks about procedural generation in games today. So the other game that made it really popular was Minecraft. But Spelunky really popularized the idea of using procedural generation in unusual genres. So how does Spelunky use procedural generation? How does it work? Well, Derek is already a very experienced level designer, so he wanted to build a system that could take advantage of this. So this is what a level looks like in Spelunky if you zoom all the way out. So normally you only see a little segment of the game. It kind of looks like this. It's much more zoomed in. But if we zoom out, what we can see is what looks like quite a random collection of spaces. But if I draw these dotted lines, what we can actually see is that this is a level made up of kind of jigsaw pieces. And each of these pieces has been hand designed by Derek with a few little adjustments, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And all his algorithm has to do is connect them together so that the exits on the sides of each room match up. So what I mean by that is if a room can be exited on the right-hand side, we want to find a room that has a matching exit to put next to it so that the player can still find their way to the exit of the level. So Derek is able to use his level design knowledge to build these tiny spaces and then build an algorithm that can connect them together. Now, if he'd just done that, it still wouldn't be quite as good as Spelunky is. So what he does is he has a lot of other small details that he adds in. So for example, there are lots of tiles in his templates that have a random chance of appearing, or he has algorithms to place treasure randomly. So even if you see the same template twice, it won't look exactly the same. And that helps confuse the player's learning and memorization and means that the game continues to feel fresh even when you've played it many, many times. So Spelunky leverages Derek's knowledge of how to design levels well, and then looks at a way to sort of turn this into a garden where there is some growth and there is some unpredictability, but it's still in these quite strongly enforced boundaries. You can kind of think of them like flower beds, like these drawn very clear lines between sections of the level. So at the other extreme, we have what I would call total chaos. So you might have seen a garden like this. Several of my family members have gardens that look like this. If you don't do anything with a garden for a while, it gets very overgrown, loads of stuff starts growing in random places. And that's sometimes what we want from our procedural generator as well. That's sometimes the starting point. So here, there isn't any control at all over what's happened, but there's also a lot of surprise and potential discoveries. Like we don't know what kind of insects or birds or plants might be growing in here. And there's something really exciting about that. And there might be a way for us to shape it slightly, like change some things that we don't like, while still allowing all of this wilderness to grow in. So an example of this would be what we call noise functions. So what you're looking at here, this kind of black and white and gray cloud pattern, this is what we call two-dimensional noise. And it's essentially a load of random values. It's a function for making random values. So we can give it a coordinate in 2D space, so an X and a Y coordinate, and the function will give us a number between 0 and 1. And to make this black and white image, we just say that 1 is white, 0 is black, and any other number is kind of gray in between. And noise is used everywhere. It was used in the film industry to create like special effects for a very long time. It still is kind of, I guess. But one very popular use for it in games is to produce maps. So what we can do is we can pick a coordinate in our map, ask the noise function what value is at this coordinate, and then say, okay, if it's less than 0.3, we'll make it ocean. And if it's more than 0.7, we'll make it mountain. And if it's, close to 0.3, maybe we'll make it beach. And we can use this quite random, quite unpredictable space, and then reinterpret it and turn it into something that's actually usable to us. And there's lots of different kinds of noise. So you can have 3D noise, so you can produce 3D landscapes. And this is one of the tools that Minecraft uses to make its worlds. And we can get more complicated with it. We can get fancier. So we can actually layer multiple kinds of noise on top of one another. And then we can do things like scale the noise and rotate it and move it around. And then we can say something like, okay, at this point, if the height of the land is above 0.5, so that's the F noise function. And if this other noise function, this G function, if that's above 0.8, then we should cover the land in forest at this point, right? So we can say that F represents sort of the height map, and G represents maybe temperature or maybe rainfall or some other weather. And this is actually how games like Minecraft do their biomes. So they use multiple noise functions to model different systems. And then they say, okay, this is a hill, but this hill is covered in trees. This hill is a desert. This hill is actually underwater because of the ocean. So there's a lot of different ways that we can take this thing that looks completely random and then shape it into something that we like. So we have much less control here than the Spelunky generator, and that means that it can do more exciting and interesting things. But it also means that we aren't able to shape it as perfectly. We might get more weeds growing or plants that we don't know about. So these are sort of the two kinds of extreme starting points for procedural generation. And typically what you do when you're designing a procedural generator is you explore between these two extremes. You might reduce the freedom of the generator to move away from the wilderness, or you might add more freedom in to move away from the ornamental garden. And eventually you'll find the sweet spot that is right for the problem you're trying to solve or the artistic goals that you have. So I wanted to give you a little example of what that looks like. And instead of talking through loads of code, because some of you might not be interested in that kind of thing, what I did was I made an example using cards. So I want to talk to you about rewilding briefly. Rewilding is a concept that's becoming more popular. But in the UK, what it means basically is that you take land that has been very controlled in the past, like used for farming, and then you just leave it to return to the state that it was originally. Sometimes you do some things to help it along, but it's basically a way to repair the ecosystem and the countryside around. So what we're going to look at now is kind of how you can take a procedural generator and add some wilderness into it, kind of rewild a generator. So in this example, I'm going to make some houses. And what I would normally start doing is you start off by drawing, just making some houses yourself. And these could be game levels, they could be anything. But for our example, we're going to be making some houses. And then I've cut them up into little pieces. So here I actually already had cards, so I kind of cheated. But you can imagine drawing them normally and then cutting them up with scissors. And then we take all of these little pieces of the thing that we want to generate. We flip them over, we shuffle them around so we don't know what we're dealing out. And then we have a pattern that we want to use to generate new things. We can kind of think of this as our algorithm. So our algorithm here is take two cards from the deck and place them on top of each other. So this is an example of a very wild generator because it can produce things that we probably weren't expecting and maybe we don't want. So this output here isn't really a building. It's two rooftops on top of each other and it doesn't make any sense. So we've gone from like total control, where we were just making the houses ourselves. And this is like total wilderness. We don't have any control over this at all. So how do we add some control back in? Well, what we can do is we can flip the cards over and we can write a little bit of information to kind of help us make decisions when we're generating our new buildings. So we don't want to give too much information. We don't want to just tell us what is on the other side. So we're just going to write one word that can help us guide the generation process. And in this case, we've written roof and building. And now we can update our algorithm. So now instead of just placing any two cards, we can say, okay, always place a roof at the top, always place a building at the bottom. And now we're getting interesting things. We've made the generator a bit less wild, but it's still wild enough to produce interesting things like a bakery that has a telescope on the roof, for example. And we can also extend the pattern to generate things that we didn't have in our original designs. So we can generate a building with 2 stories to it, for example. And as we do this, we might realize, but now there's a problem because our second floor has a door in it, and that door can't be used. It's not very safe to just walk out and fall down to the ground. So we might go back to the generator and add more information in. We might say, okay, these cards are actually the ground floor of a building. And then we can update our pattern. So we say, okay, make sure that only ground floor pieces are put at the bottom. And this allows us to sort of go through this process of going back and forth, kind of like Emily did, looking at what the generator produces, thinking about how we need to change it, what information can we give it so that it's not too restricted, but it also doesn't have these things that maybe we don't want. You can kind of think of them as like pruning off parts of a plant that we don't want to have around. And obviously here I used buildings because it was like an easy example, but you might have different types of domain knowledge that you could apply. Maybe you're a level designer and you can chop up levels and label them as to how difficult you think they are or how exciting. We could chop up pieces of music and label different melody bars or leitmotifs with different emotions. Or maybe if we're writers, we can have lists of adjectives and verbs and proverbs, and think about like what they make the reader feel and put them in different character descriptions. It's just this idea of chopping something up, adding labeled knowledge, and tweaking that knowledge to kind of shape how controlled the generator is and how free it is. So I thought at this point, what I would do is show you a couple of examples of generators that I've made, and they kind of represent like different applications of these ideas. So the first one is from a game called Rogue Process, which I started making quite a long time ago now, and actually canceled. I never released it, even though it got quite far along. But Rogue Process was an action platformer where you broke into skyscrapers and stole things from corporations. And I took a very similar approach to Spelunky in generating their levels. So we had these rooms that were labeled, and I had a tool that I could use to design new rooms. And just like Spelunky, each room was labeled with where the exits were. So you can see this room has an exit at the bottom left and the bottom right. It was actually slightly more detailed than Spelunky. So each of Spelunky's rooms only has 4 exits, north, south, east, west. These rooms actually had 8 exits. So they had 2 exits above, below, left, and right. And that allowed us to make much more complicated building designs. But the nice thing about this system, just like with Spelunky's, is that I could go in and play the game, look at a level, see something I didn't like, and then go back to the generator and change it slightly, and kind of go through this cycle of iteration and improvement. This series of games, however, is a bit more strange. It's a bit more of an unusual use of procedural generation. So this is a series of 3 games, one of which is still being worked on with one of my students. This is the student, Florence Smith-Nichols, and they call these games generative archaeology games. So Florence is an archaeologist, but is now also a game AI PhD student. And they're really interested in how we experience procedural generation and what that experience does to someone's interpretation of what's in front of them. So they were really interested in taking some of these prototypes and doing some studies with them. So how does a generative archaeology game work? So we start off by generating a small world. So it needs to be somewhere quite self-contained. So it could be like a village or a spaceship. And we need to think of some kind of event that's going to happen that has a beginning and an end. So for the village example that we're going to see in a minute, we start when the village is founded and we simulate the village until it eventually ends. Everyone leaves, either because they run out of food or water or animals attack. And we make sure that that ending always happens. We don't have open-ended simulations. Then we simulate the world and record everything that happens. So we know the start and the end point, but we don't know how it's going to transition through it from start to end. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. And we record lots of information as it goes along. We leave all of this information behind, and then the player arrives after the end has happened and can explore and look at the ruins and what's left behind and kind of tell stories based on that. So Nothing Beside Remains was the first one of these I made. I made it in 48 hours for Proc Jam, in fact. As you can see, it's very simple graphics. It just uses text. But we basically simulate a village until the village collapses and then let the player explore it. And if you're interested in hearing more about this project and the next one, Condition Unknown, I have a video on YouTube called Procedurally Generating Information Games, where I talk about both of these projects. But briefly, as you walk around the village, you can examine objects. Some of the objects have quite uninteresting descriptions, or at the very least, they're not crucial to understanding the village. But some of them will hint at what happened to the village. They'll give you a little hint of what might have gone on. So in this one, which is on an altar in a church, the villagers have engraved fields of crops and plants doing really well. And this is probably because they had famine problems. They ran out of food, and so they were kind of praying for good harvests. So we don't tell the player this. We just leave all of this information in the village, and we see what they think when they come across it. Florence has been doing some studies, so I don't know how this GIF is going to look with zoom compression, but we've basically had people exploring these generated villages and recording what they do. So this is the path of a player exploring one of these villages, and you can see them walking all around, looking at different things. We also used questionnaires to find out kind of what they thought about these villages, what their interpretations were. And on the next slide here, what you can see is all of our participants, all of their paths modeled at once. So you can see there's a huge variety in how people explore these spaces and understand them. So there's no objective and Nothing Beside Remains. For our survey, we were asking them to kind of pick an object and talk about it. But in general, there's nothing specific to do here. But about a year after I made Nothing Beside Remains, I made a game called Condition Unknown. And Condition Unknown is based on a movie called The Thing. If you've not seen it, it's a very good movie where this Arctic research station gets attacked by a monster and everyone kind of tries to fight it. So in Condition Unknown, you turn up at this lab in the middle of nowhere after something bad has happened, and you have to kind of find out what's happened. It's a little bit like Return of the Obra Dinn, which is a really good indie game. You kind of have to find out what happened to each crew member. And again, we simulate what's happening, and this time we simulate it in much more detail. So people will have routines that they go around through the lab, and then as the emergency starts unfolding, like the monster turns up, they will have different routines that trigger to sort of bring the simulation to an end. And all the time that they're doing this, we're making records. So when they see things, they radio to other people on the crew and they tell them what's happening, like they've seen a fire or someone's hurt, something like that. And this allows us to leave information behind for the player. So unlike Nothing Beside Remains, which was quite abstract, Condition Unknown is quite specific. We will tell the player, this thing definitely happened in this place at this time, and all of this information is real. So this simulation is actually giving them knowledge that they can use to solve the puzzle of the game. Stargrave is it's sort of a follow-up to these two games and that we're working on right now. And Stargrave has gone through a lot of changes, and I actually forgot to update this slide before I gave this talk. So initially, we were planning to simulate the crew of a spaceship and how the spaceship crashed, basically, how it came to be abandoned, and then have you come on board and try and fix the spaceship. But what we're actually looking at now is, this is actually a very interesting example for this talk. When we were thinking about simulating the crew, the simulation was too uncontrollable. It was actually too wild. And so in order to make it a project that we felt we had a good control over, we had to make it less wild. We had to prune it a bit, cut off some bits that were too hard to manage. And Florence is actually developing this game with me. So we're working on this together for the first time. So we've changed our approach to it. But the basic principle is the same. Like all of these games are about having this big wilderness, this simulation, and then thinking about how we can shape it. So with the village, we have to make sure that the village always ends up abandoned. With the spaceship, we have to make sure that the spaceship always breaks down so that the player can come and fix it. So we have to think about how much freedom do we want to give the simulation? How much should we force things to happen? And we don't need to know anything about what's happened, because that's what the player is there to do. They're coming to solve the mystery. So this is an example of a kind of a series of games that are designed around wilderness. They're designed around chaos. We don't need to have like a lot of promises about what this content can and can't do, because if the player can't solve this level, that's okay. Like sometimes you can't solve a mystery, and that's fine for our design goals with this game. So those are some examples of games that I've made kind of in my spare time. Some of them have become research tools, but they weren't designed to be. They were just things that I made for the joy of it. But I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about Puck, which is my AI research system currently. It's the successor to Angelina. So I've spent my whole career so far making systems that design games. All of these things are screenshots from different Angelina projects. We designed arcade games. We entered a game jam in the top right with it. We made games based on newspaper articles. It's in the bottom left. And the bottom right shows the last version of Angelina that I made before moving on to Puck. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to build a system that you could watch make games. So you could actually see the process and understand it a bit better. If you remember at the start of the talk, I said that I was really interested in how people understand AI and what they think about AI. And a big part of that is giving them things to look at so that they can understand the process. Angelina kind of inspired Puck as this new system that would be emphasizing connection to people and allowing people to watch what it's doing. So how do you design a game? Like, how do you come up with an idea for a game compared to, levels in Spelunky? Well, it's actually very similar, the approach that we use. So if you look at this is the description of noughts and crosses. So players take turns placing pieces on a 3x3 grid. First player to get 3 in a row wins. So this is a casual description of noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe. But what we can do is we can, just like in Spelunky, we can kind of draw dotted lines around parts of this description and cut them out. Like we can completely remove them. And then in its place, we can put different things from different games. So maybe instead of placing pieces, we drop them. Maybe it's a 7x6 grid now. Maybe the objective is 4 in a row. And suddenly we have a different game. We have Connect 4. So you can see here how, using very similar language, we've moved from one game design to another. So just like moving bits of a level around in Spelunky gives us a different platformer level, now we have a different premise for a game. And there are lots of different pieces that we could put in here. And we can think of them either from existing games, or maybe we can come up with our own new ones. But it's not hard to think about different things that could be slotted into these gaps. However, unlike Spelunky's level designer, designing rules for games is a lot more complicated. So in Spelunky, if we make sure that the exits for rooms connect to one another, that's the only thing that matters. Whatever happens in the room is not really important. And it's quite hard to make a bad level in Spelunky. But designing a game's rule set is much more complicated. It would be like if you went out into your garden and pulled up a weed, and as soon as you cut the weed out, 2 of the trees at the other end of the garden just fell over. It's really easy to change one rule and have a game completely fall apart. But the reason why wilderness is so exciting is because we don't know what's out there. So working in game design is a really exciting area, because there probably are very exciting new ideas for games waiting to be discovered. And by thinking about game design, we get to think about how we design games as well. So I've improved as a game designer a lot by thinking about how Puck should design games. So the way we actually get Puck to sort good games from bad games is we get it to play them. So you can see this video playing in the background is Puck trying to play games. And since I gave this talk last, Puck is now publicly available. You can download kind of an old build of it now. I'm still working on new updates, but if you go to puck.games, it's on the last slide, so don't worry. You can download your own version and watch it play. But Puck will play games like this, like you're seeing now, and you can watch it do this. And the important thing is that Puck remembers everything it does. So Puck makes notes of every game that it plays, every result that comes out of it. And the reason for that is that we want it to learn from the bad games as well as learning from the good games. So we don't want it to only look for good games, which, you know, and that was how Angelina worked, kind of. It would look for good games, and after a few hours, it would give us one. Puck remembers everything, and that means that it can change in the future. It means that it can use that knowledge to think of, maybe even teach people what it thinks is a bad game. So Puck is a very different project, and definitely aimed at exploring the wilderness completely, like not just like throwing weeds away because we don't want them, but like understanding what this weed is, and is it a weed, or is it actually kind of an interesting plant? Maybe it tastes good, maybe it has beautiful flowers, like maybe we should keep some of it around. So this is more about exploring the wilderness rather than taming it and cutting it back, and just kind of understanding what we have around us. What we're hoping to do in the near future is to kind of expand a bit more what Puck can do and what we do with Puck's games. So this is a game called Antitrust that Puck designed, and that was re-implemented by Rihanna Suen to make it look very beautiful and work on mobile and stuff like that. So we're going to be releasing this soon, hopefully, along with some more games that Puck has designed. And to start getting feedback from people about why a game is interesting, why it's broken, and hopefully have it such that Puck can learn from this feedback and make better games. This isn't playable publicly yet, but hopefully it will be soon. But Rihanna has a bunch of generative stuff. If you like what's in this talk, you will definitely like Rihanna's work at vividfacts.itch.io. So I think, I think I'm about right for time. So we're going to very gently, there's still a bunch of slides left, but we're entering kind of the summary, because I want to sort of reflect on some of the things that I've said today. So if you go and look about procedural generation online or generative AI, if you look about DALL-E and Midjourney, or you look at GDC talks about procedural generation, you'll hear people talk about the output. You'll hear people talk about how to fix your procedural generator, or how to make it better, or how to make it produce better levels or art or music or anything like that. And that's because when we think about procedural generation, we think about it as a replacement for people doing work themselves. So like, I could design these levels, but instead I'm going to build a procedural generator. So obviously I just care about like, how good are the levels? That's the only thing I care about. But making a procedural generator is an artistic practice. It's a creative practice, and it can be joyful, just the act of doing it. You know, when you read Emily Short's appendix to the Annals of the Peregrines, you get a sense of how much she enjoyed the process of making this system. And that's how I feel about procedural generation. It's not just about the things that we produce at the end, it's also the act of making them. In January of this year, I entered something called January, where we make something generative every day for the month of January. And I made a whole bunch of stuff that you can find descriptions of on Cohost, as well as source code for. They're all written in processing. And I probably won't go back to any of these things. They were just one-off things that I made for myself, but I loved it so much. Like, it was just really fun to think about how to make something, to experiment with it, to share it with people at the end of the day. So procedural generation is a craft. It's as much a craft as any other creative practice. It's not just like a means to an end. Gardening, like no one has gardens so that they can just so that they can cut and sell the flowers. You know, we make a garden so that we can think about nature, have time to reflect on things, watch the passing of time, and have something nice to look at. There's a lot of reasons why we garden, and a lot of reasons why we make procedural generators. And so I want to encourage you to try and make generative systems and play about with them, even if you don't use them in your actual games, because just making procedural generators, I think, helps me be a better designer, a better programmer, because I'm thinking about the process of making something. In our field, we have this thing called the 1,000 bowls of oatmeal problem, and it's usually used to criticize procedural generators for not being very interesting. So the joke is that if I made you 1,000 bowls of oatmeal or porridge, each one would be unique, but they would all kind of be the same. Like, they're technically unique, you know, they have slightly different amounts of oatmeal in them, but they're all really just bowls of oatmeal, and that's boring. But the thing is, if you actually built a machine to generate oatmeal recipes, or you built a robot to make oatmeal, or if you just perfected your own oatmeal recipe yourself one winter, you would learn so much about cooking, about oatmeal, about your tastes. Just making that generator, even if even if it turns out to not be very interesting, you would learn so many things just thinking about how to make the perfect bowl of oatmeal. So sometimes we can get a bit obsessed with the ends when we're doing something like this and not think about the process and how that improves us. So to go over the points I made at the beginning, procedural generation is kind of like tending a garden. You can have a very tidy one or a very chaotic one. It's about what you want and about how you navigate the space in between. This is my friend's garden. He recently cleaned it up, so it looks more like this now. And that's more how he wants it to look like. But maybe you prefer the overgrown version. Like, that's okay. Thinking about how we make something, thinking about how we make a generator is a lot more important than complicated technology or systems or languages. Derek Yu's procedural generator is one of the simplest, most basic algorithms in the whole field, and it's probably also the best procedural generator that's ever existed. It's incredibly good at what it does. So it's not about how complicated your technology is, it's about whether it fits the creative problem you're trying to solve. And thinking about the process is super, super satisfying. Which is also why a lot of generative AI stuff doesn't often fit into this space, because it has a different function, I think, for people when they use it. And finally, I hope that you can enjoy the process of making things that make things. It can be frustrating when you want a procedural generator to produce like good outputs and it's not doing it. And sometimes people joke that procedural generation doesn't save you any time at all. In fact, it probably costs you time. It's probably slower than just making stuff yourself. But that's okay if you can get kind of joy out of doing it and learn stuff from it as well. No one makes a garden because they think it will be quick or easy. They do it because hopefully they like doing it. And I hope you'll enjoy it too. That's all from me for today. If you want more from me, you can find my website, possibilityspace.org, or if you want to grab a copy of Puck, it's at puck.games. Please feel free to email me whenever you like and get in touch with me. I'm still on Twitter. I'm on other things as well, like co-host. And follow some of my students as well. They're all incredible people doing interesting work in games and creativity. And I also wanted to mention, Knives and Paintbrushes is a little research group I'm a part of. And Ill Omens, which has the wrong logo there, is my itch. And yeah, thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
You're getting applause here in the audience. Maybe you could hear it. I'm not sure.
I did.
Obviously, you can't see them.
Shall I stop sharing, or would you rather see my face or the slide?
I mean, I think we're done with the slide. I mean, it's a great slide, but your face is very good too. So let's see. Oh, now I'm on the speaker thing. I wanted to check whether anyone in the audience has a question. I can repeat it into the microphone, or if there is anything online. Something I just got a question in the weekend. Mike, I don't know if you heard about this Swedish game company, Mind Art, who actually they're laying off half of the staff, like 25 people, the ones who made Project Utopia.
Wow.
Yeah. And the newspaper contacted me asking, like, so what do you think about that? And I'm not really sure what to say, because just as you said, I mean, we know that PCG is not necessarily the cheapest, right?
Yeah. A lot of companies are making very strange decisions at the moment. There is also, people keep telling me that the tech industry is suffering a little bit, like some companies are trying to make themselves smaller. But yeah, some companies are definitely obsessed with the idea that these generative AI models are going to solve all their creative problems. And I'm sure they do have uses, but there's a lot of situations where, like, yeah, they're not gonna solve everyone's problems, and that's even if you think that they're going to be here forever, which is not a given. So yeah, it is quite shocking to see companies taking those moves. You see a similar thing in programming as well. A lot of people now say that they're using Copilot to write their code. And I don't know about your students, but at King's College, we have a real issue of we don't really like, I'm going to start teaching again this year soon, and we don't really know what to do about, students using generative models for their homework and stuff. It's a very strange time. But that's actually, I think maybe, next time I give this talk, I'll update it a little bit, but it is interesting to think about these generative models because they produce such interesting outputs. I understand why people like them. But when I was going over these slides to prepare for today, it just reminded me of, I value this process so much. Like, I think it's like, they're like two different fields, really. They're kind of disconnected. Like, the act of making a system that makes other things is like such an interesting way to examine something. And you do lose that when you just kind of type a prompt into something. Not that that's, prompting is its own thing, but it's a very different thing. Yeah. I just noticed the comment in the chat about you being famous. Yeah, Mirjam is I'll embarrass Mirjam briefly, but Mirjam is very, very beloved throughout our field, and all of my students want to meet her. And I guess when you just get taught by Mirjam on a weekly basis, it's hard to appreciate that. But Mirjam is very, very well known and loved throughout the game AI field and beyond.
Well, no, thank you, Mike. No, I am quite embarrassed now. But
I think it's good to know because it's hard to, you don't always appreciate who you're being taught by sometimes. But it's a real privilege to be at the same university. Yeah. Oh, there's another question.
Yes, I will read it. Hang on, I will bring it forth here. So, do you think we will reach a point where AI will be able to create big fun and engaging games with little or no human input?
So one of the interesting things about questions like this is that in many ways, ChatGPT shouldn't it shouldn't be possible for ChatGPT to exist. So in order for ChatGPT to exist, someone had to be willing to lose a lot of money. They had to be willing to spend so much money to get to the point where it could maybe possibly exist, So lots of things are possible, but there would never be any reason to actually do them. So I think about this often about an AI that could create huge games. Like, let's say, an AI that could create an Assassin's Creed with no input. I think it's possible, but I think the companies involved would never, ever want to spend the amount of money that would be required to do it, because I don't think it would benefit them that much. And I don't think there's much demand for it, particularly. What I do hope is that AI will be used to create games that couldn't exist without AI. So one example that we're looking at in our lab is the idea of an esport where the rules are changing all the time. So the challenge is not how good you are at the game, it's how good you are at learning a new game. So that's an example of something that maybe you would need an AI to help design, because the AI is going to have to be redesigning the game as it's being played. So that's kind of where I hope it goes. So I think so the question is, do I think we will reach a point? I don't think we will. I think it is theoretically possible to do that. But I think there's lots of cultural and social and economic reasons why we won't, probably. But we'll have to see.
Yeah, it is interesting to see how it's going, because we have, just the amount of processing power that has gone into training these large language models, it's enormous amounts of money. So
yeah,
might actually,
and we don't really know how long they can keep it up for. We assume it will keep going, but we don't actually know what the future holds. So yeah.
Yes, we have a question in the room. Where do you start if you want to build a PCG model?
It depends what you want to generate, of course. But what I start by is kind of like I did in the talk, where I start by making by hand some things that I would like the machine to generate. So if I want to generate levels for a game, I'll design 5 or 10 levels by hand and think, these are the kinds of things I'd like my generator to be able to produce. And then you might cut them up like I did. You could cut them up and build you could do it with paper, like an algorithm to reshuffle them together. Or you might think about the process by which you drew the levels. Maybe there's actually like a kind of a set of steps that you could repeat. You can also look for inspiration from people who've tried to generate similar things. That's why ProcJam is quite nice. So the procedural generation jam has a Discord server. I didn't set it up. The community did it. There's hundreds of people always chatting about things. So it might be that someone else has made something similar that you could like grab and make some modifications to. If you want to build kind of a machine learned model for generating content, I'm not a great person for that. I haven't done a lot of that stuff, but I'd really recommend Matthew Goodsdial, actually, I think is a great starting point. But you'll also have loads of great people on speaking on this course. I don't remember, is Matthew speaking on this course or not? He's like 8 hours behind. So he is. Oh, great.
Next week, yeah.
Mirjam's got like everyone that you could want to hear from on this course. There you go. So you can ask Matthew that question if you're interested in the machine learning side of things. I visited Matthew's research group over the summer, and they're just an astonishing group of people. Matthew is a really great researcher, so that'll be a great talk next week.
I had no idea. Wow, that you were there. Cool.
Yeah, I'll tell you all about it later. I'll send you an email.
Yes, please do. So we're starting to run out of time here. Do we have any more questions in the room or in the chat? In that case, Mike, it was such an honor to have you, and thank you for a wonderful talk.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, take care.
And maybe I can come and give it in person one year.
Yes, I would love that. Please do.
All right. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you all at various things. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Åh gud, jag ser ut som en kanin.